Something didn't feel quite right, thought Halina. Maybe it was okay that they were meeting in her therapist's house. Maybe it was okay that her therapist floated into the room 10 minutes late without so much as an apology. Maybe it was even okay that her therapist felt less and less like a therapist and more like a really controlling or overbearing friend. Someone who could confide in Halina and gossip to her, telling her all the things she couldn't tell anyone else. It made Halina feel special. This was an impressive woman, clearly concerned with appearing wealthy and successful. And if she doted on Halina and made her feel like she was different from all of her other clients, it must mean she saw something unique in her, right? But this? No. This time it was too much. This time would be the straw that broke the camel's back. The can in her therapist's hand, it wasn't just some sort of fancy water. Hard seltzer, that's what it said on the side. And when her therapist went for a sip, Halina could see from how far she tilted it back that her therapist had already drank quite a bit. Suddenly, everything snapped into focus. All the ways that the norms had shifted and the boundaries evaporated. The ways that their therapy had morphed into something quite different than therapy. Halina decided to speak up for herself and name just how uncomfortable she was. And from the way that her therapist exploded in response, well, she realized everything was about to change. I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist chair. My guest today is Halina. Halina is a practicing therapist whose own story of therapy harm, coupled with her invaluable insights, really illuminates so much about why the systems and institutions of mental health care too often fail to protect those who seek help. Halina's story occurred when she was in grad school. She was just past 30 and she was thinking about trying to have a baby. But she'd had diabetes since she was a teenager, and sometimes experienced a lot of distress about that, even more so when she thought about getting pregnant. So she decided to look for help in managing her anxiety about her health and in processing everything that comes with wanting to start a family.
I was in grad school to become a therapist also when I went to this therapist. And the reason that I went into the field, funny enough, none of us are immune to problems in healthcare and therapy. So my grandma, when she was older, I guess in my grandma's later years, she had cancer. It metastasized to her digestive system. Her doctor decided to take the liberty of just telling her and my grandpa that she was experiencing depression and tried to get her on antidepressants, didn't tell her that she had a cancer diagnosis. And as she was experiencing more and more pain, I had to watch my grandma in her 80s experience the most profound humiliation and gaslighting imaginable. And it really put a huge strain on my grandparents' beautiful marriage. It put a huge strain on our family. And after she passed, it took quite some years to get back to it. But I decided to become a therapist because I wanted to support families that had been through the ringer in the healthcare system and individuals as well. Because I thought I had such a clear awareness and I thought I was going into it critical thinking, kind of being an educated consumer. And as someone who was a burgeoning therapist myself, I didn't think it could happen to me. I didn't think that this dynamic of someone in an authority position exploiting their expertise and making you question yourself, I guess I thought I was immune because of what I had witnessed with my grandma. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. I think when we go somewhere and we're working on something that is so vulnerable and so raw that we so desperately want to heal in ourselves, it puts us open to the influence of others who are going to proclaim expertise about us that really they don't have. Because ultimately, the client is the expert on themselves. The therapist should be the expert on the tools, the resources, and sort of the perspective shifts that might help. We should be trusted to appraise ourselves accurately.
After everything her grandma had been through, Halina thought she knew what red flags to look for. And she was studying to become a therapist herself, so she was optimistic that counseling could offer the support she needed. She also knew that therapy is most effective when the client is able to let their guard down, which makes it even more crucial that the clinician is actually a safe person.
That's the flip side of trust, right? Because in order to sort of lean in and do the work, you have to be to some degree vulnerable. But vulnerability is called vulnerability because there is risk involved. I think so often in these bad therapy situations, I know that my colleagues are really quick to try to find the fault in the client. A lot of the people I work with have had really bad therapy experiences. I kind of seek that out in clients. I want to make sure that I'm available for it because a lot of people won't work with folks who've had bad experiences. And I think it's because a lot of us don't want to believe that our peers are capable of either such evil or such negligence. But the fact is that the research shows that people who've got some serious, serious problems gravitate toward professions like medicine, therapy, law, because they can exert their power. And it's not a ton of people. Maybe it's 1 in 50 or something like that. But I don't remember the exact statistic, but it's definitely higher percentages in our fields. And I think what's hard is when you see your colleagues so brittle about the idea that we're all capable of making mistakes and some of us are capable of doing far, far worse. If we don't hold space for that possibility, then clients run the risk of getting further gaslighted when they go to their next therapist. And sometimes you really, really need support from someone else to get over what happened before. And that's not always a therapist. Sometimes it's a church, a meditation center, a best friend, lots of pathways. But if the very industry that might have set you up for harm's way can't hold space for the fact that there might be something that needs remediation, then where do people go?
Halina had been in therapy a few different times when she was younger. She believes it can be a helpful tool for navigating certain chapters of life. Not necessarily something you should need every week for the rest of your life, just one of the many healthcare resources to help you get through hard times or big changes. And there are very few bigger changes than preparing to have a baby.
I had a dietitian who I had been working with to try to manage the diabetes overwhelm and sort out how I would need to eat during pregnancy, things like that. She ended up leaving the location where she was working and she moved into a new office with this psychologist, right? And so for a while, I was just seeing the dietitian, but I said to her at some point, this is getting really overwhelming for me. I know that we're trying to make it easy, but I'm just feeling really anxious and overwhelmed. Is that psychologist that you're renting from in the office next door, is she any good? I'm in the market for somebody. I don't mind private pay. And she said, you know what? You could check her out. She's good. And unfortunately, that wasn't the entire case. I later found out that she felt kind of funny saying anything otherwise, but she and a number of people within the health and wellness psychology side of things here in my city know this woman to be totally off the rocker. But off I went thinking that my dietitian was giving her a ringing endorsement. And before this psychologist completely went off at me toward the end of this unfortunate clinical relationship, the dietitian moved out of her office. There was kind of a gap there. I didn't really know what happened. I didn't want to ask, but I wondered if maybe she was just kind of moving to an office closer to her home or something. I later found out that this psychologist completely went off at the dietitian in a paranoid tirade, accusing the dietitian of talking crap about her and was like, you need to move out. You have to go. How dare you? And the woman had not done that. And so this dietitian was like clearly I'll go. And she took all her stuff out that weekend. And I guess the psychologist approached the dietitian and said, hey, please don't tell Halina about that. And she respected her wishes. But if only I had known, that had happened several months before things completely imploded, and I could have been spared if this dietitian had had a little more courage. Pretty sad when I found that out.
Does this part ring a bell? If it does, it's because this is just one of so many stories in which a clinician's ethical lapses and abusive patterns are an open secret. But nobody's willing or able to do anything about it or even speak about it openly. So you have new unsuspecting clients lined up for harm, one after another, while people who know better turn a blind eye to all the red flags. But let's back up to the beginning, when Halina still had every reason to believe this psychologist, who we'll call Valerie, would actually have had her best interests in mind.
The first time I spoke with her was actually on the phone. So I left her a voicemail and I said, hey, I'm one of Christine's clients. I'm looking for therapy on diabetes to try and manage this stuff. And we had a great phone call. It was a little salesy, but she was very confident. She was very warm. She seemed very, very confident in being able to get me the tools I needed, fast results on mental shifts, and being able to tackle this. And she painted some really beautiful pictures of hope and of what it could look like when I had moved through all of this anxiety. I was sold. And then off we went. And now there wasn't a ton of paperwork. There wasn't a really formal intake process. I later learned that she really didn't have much in the case of records. I'd never saw a treatment plan, but off we went off to the races. I started seeing her every other week at that point.
Valerie's office was in an affluent part of town, and it was really beautiful. Lots of nice furniture, high-end decorations. It was clear that she was very concerned about appearances and wanted to project a successful, kind of wealthy aesthetic.
So she was in her mid-50s. She had brown hair. She definitely had had some plastic surgery work, which she actually had told me about as well. She was on the thinner side, and she used to talk often about how she used to be overweight. And one of her cachets for her practice was, I lost weight and you can too. She was very, very, very into her image and her appearance. And you could tell that she put a lot of effort into what she looked like.
The first couple of months were pretty uneventful. Valerie gave Halina some tools for thinking about her relationship with food, and they talked about things like mindfulness. It was all very practical, not a whole lot of depth, but some of the tools were helpful. And Halina was optimistic that this would be a positive part of her healthcare journey. But pretty soon things took a sharp turn, and the nature of their relationship started changing dramatically.
She sent me a voicemail, and it sounded really panicked and frazzled about how she couldn't get into her office, so she was using someone else's office, and then she was being kicked out of that office for the day. And she was wondering if I could come to her house for the therapy session. It was a little strange. I know that some cities do have people that work out of their homes, but I hadn't been invited to this person's house before. I thought it was a clinical relationship. It's a little odd to go to someone's house, but at the same time, I also felt kind of flattered. But I was sure, like, as long as you don't have cats, I'll come over. So I ended up seeing her at her house that day. And I think that's when things started to change. I think that was a few months in. And we kind of pivoted from working on what I had come in for, which was diabetes, distress, food anxiety, planning to become a mom, stuff like that, to all of a sudden these much, I guess at the time I would have labeled it as deeper discussions. And she started self-disclosing a ton, and in very strange ways too, Leah. Literally one of the things that she said was that, and it sent chills down my spine. She said, the day that her mother died was the worst day of her life, but also the best day of her life. And as she said it, she had this creepy smile. And I'm like, why are you telling me this, right? But then part of me was just intrigued, right? And so I sat and I listened, and well, clearly there must be a clinical point to this. Maybe she wants to talk to me about nuance in relationships or something. But it really didn't have any rhyme or reason. She self-disclosed that she was not attracted to her husband for the longest time when they first met. And she dated him anyway because of XYZ other factors. She confided about colleagues, which in many ways made me feel weird, but also made me feel flattered that, oh, this person is giving me the lay of the land in this city that I'm going to be practicing therapy in when I'm done with grad school. And over time, I didn't notice it in the moment, but in many ways, it felt like she was buying my loyalty and my continued participation with her own self-disclosures. It felt like she was trying to make me feel special, like she was confiding in me. And then she started having me come to these weekly classes, and I didn't really know what they were at the time. I know now, if anyone has heard of dialectical behavior therapy, she said to me, I've just gotten into this new modality, and I know you're not learning this in your marriage and family therapy program, but it'd be something really good for you to learn. So come on in. You can just come like a regular participant, but I know that you're there as a grad student, and so you'll be able to immerse yourself and learn this model. Now, I'll get to that in a minute, but that was used against me later on after the giant blow up.
In grad school, future practitioners learn what's sometimes called the therapeutic frame. So this includes office policies, confidentiality, communication boundaries, scheduling consistency, and those sort of things. When put together, all these minor norms and procedures help to foster the sense of safety and stability that meaningful therapy relies on. Any change to the therapeutic frame should be approached with a great deal of care. And when something big changes abruptly or flippantly, like, say, meeting at the therapist's house instead of her office, it might be a sign that a healthy therapeutic alliance is no longer the number one priority. That was certainly the case with Valerie, who it seemed was more concerned with making Halina feel special and gaining her loyalty than with the actual work of therapy. There was no longer talk about diabetes or food anxiety or starting a family in session. Sometimes it felt like Valerie wanted to be Halina's personal mentor, and other times like she just wanted a friend she could dump all her personal stuff on. But as we see again and again in therapy harm stories, these dynamics can be so difficult to recognize in the moment, and Halina sometimes struggled with self-esteem, and she was flattered by the special attention Valerie gave her. So even though their quote-unquote therapy no longer looked like what Halina had been hoping for, she kept going back. And she started attending Valerie's class in DBT, or dialectical behavioral therapy.
So typically the way it works is participants will go to a group every week for 90 minutes to 2 hours. They'll also see an individual therapist once a week, and they'll fill out something called a diary card. And I kid you not, it looks like a graph paper almost, and it has habits that you are either trying to do or trying to not do down one side, and then days of the week and other contexts across the other axis. And so you're supposed to log how many times you did a certain behavior or did a certain skill. And it's very, very behavioral. It's almost like dog training yourself. And sometimes when you're trying to create habit change, that can be helpful, but I see it as a little bit mechanistic. Now, the background of dialectical behavior therapy is that Marsha Linehan, who founded the format, worked with highly, highly suicidal people. What she found was that those 4 skill sets that we were talking about before, interpersonal effectiveness, mindfulness, emotional regulation, distress tolerance, were things that folks who were very, very suicidal had a lot of trouble with. Getting their needs met, feeling consistently all right in the world, things like that. And so that was initially her target audience for this. But then over time, she found that it was really effective for people with something called borderline personality disorder, which is essentially when people have struggles with having consistent self-identity, maybe have some impulsive behaviors. There's a lot of intensity there. And I won't go into the whole thing, but that label happens to be an identifier that a lot of therapists use as code for difficult client, or use as code for don't blame me, the client is the broken one, right? The other thing about DBT is that these skills are actually really, really effective for people who don't have borderline personality disorder too. So for example, if you're trying to maintain a boundary with someone who's super, super pushy, there's a model called the Dear Man, where you follow this framework to assert your boundaries and maintain what your goal is in the conversation and not be pushed over. These are things that are helpful to everybody. And the skills that come with this particular model are helpful to everyone. So when she did send me to this weekly group under the guise of being a grad student and learning this model because she thought it was the best thing since sliced bread, I was really grateful to learn about it because I wasn't learning about these behavioral skills in the program I was in. Unfortunately, when people get sent to a program like this, even if you've never talked about diagnosis, if anything goes wrong in the therapy or anything happens, it gives the clinician the credence to say, well, I sent them to that because they have borderline personality disorder, right? And that was never in my file. It was always straight up anxiety. I've never had an addiction. I've always had a really consistent sense of self. Abandonment doesn't really faze me. Those are some of the things that come with this.
Valerie invited Halina to this class with the promise of professional training. It was only later that Halina learned that her very presence in this class would be used against her. That it could be all Valerie needed to slap her with the label of borderline personality disorder. If that sounds overly dramatic, or like we're reading too much into it, I cannot stress to you enough how common this sort of thing is. Prior to launching this podcast, I have to admit, I had never heard of the diagnosis BPD. However, within just a few weeks of conducting interviews, I realized there seemed to be a theme. Every single person who shared their story with me had been retroactively labeled as borderline after they filed a complaint with the state against their therapist. Now, why might that be, you ask? All too often, BPD is thrown around as shorthand for crazy, unhinged, unreliable. If a clinician needs to bolster their own reputation by tarnishing the reputation of a client, one of the go-to tactics is looking for any reason they can to find a way to break out the BPD diagnosis. This is especially pronounced among female clients. When it's wielded incorrectly, borderline is the latest in a long line of buzzwords used to disparage women who speak up for themselves. For example, difficult or shrill. Or my favorite throwback, hysterical. Just to be clear, BPD is a real diagnosis that can manifest in a lot of different symptoms, and treating it can require focused, intensive care. But it's also a notoriously difficult diagnosis to recognize and to understand. So it's easy to toss around as sort of a scare tactic without much scrutiny or pushback. To underscore just how common this is, I recently heard from a woman who'd filed an ethical complaint against her therapist. I told her she needed to request copies of the session notes as soon as possible. And I warned her that it was likely she would find a label of BPD when she went through the notes. She said no way. He wouldn't do that. It had never come up in therapy, and she didn't check the diagnostic boxes at all. But she got the notes, and sure enough, there it was. Right there in the intake session. Diagnosis? Borderline personality disorder. By inviting Halina to her class, Valerie was making sure she'd be able to cover her tracks. If things went sideways and Halina tried holding her accountable, Valerie could just point to this class and say, "See that? See? She attended this because she's borderline. You know, she's crazy." We're going to talk more about BPD in the next episode, because it's a pivotal part of Halina's story. But that wasn't the only thing about that class that was setting off all sorts of alarm bells.
This is the part that left me creeped out at the time, but I didn't say anything. I kind of shoved it down. She said to me, "You're going to get a chance to meet the other people in these groups who are suffering with really severe addictions and codependency and all of these things. And you're going to get to learn by just observing them. And they're going to think that you're just a participant." Looking back on that now, I'm like, oh my gosh, this woman exploited almost like a circus these other clients that she had that were in this room under the guise of my learning and being taken under her wing as some kind of protege. Looking back on it, a lot of these people were lovely. There was one guy who would run around trying to hit people up for money, but a lot of them, they were normal people. And the way that she sold it, if these clients had heard her talk about them, I imagine they would have been quite humiliated. And I look back and I still feel kind of ashamed that her wooing me to sort of gawk in some ways, or to learn through sort of watching these people who didn't realize that I was there as a grad student, it just feels icky. And I have to live with that.
Again, by bad-mouthing the other classmates, Valerie was trying to draw Halina close and gain her loyalty. She was telling Halina, "You're not like the others. You're special." And the implication is that since you're special, your therapy doesn't have to look like everyone else's. So Valerie could continue to push boundaries, continue to redefine the therapeutic frame until there was essentially no frame at all.
Moving forward, I was going to these groups at her office every week, and I was going to therapy at her house, because at some point it switched to just always being at her house. And it wasn't Tuesday or Wednesday night at 7 anymore. It was Sunday nights at her house. There were no clients before or after me, and things became more and more casual over time. There were times when she would come downstairs into session wearing pajamas or not wearing a bra or things like that, which was super, super weird. But I'm like, okay, I guess we're at her house. She shared things about other clients. She shared things about colleagues. And literally, I think once she came in with a full bowl of spaghetti, eating her dinner. She would text in session. Occasionally, I thought I smelled alcohol coming off of the cup that she was drinking. But I didn't grow up around a ton of alcohol. I mean, like, my family is not in recovery or sober. It wasn't part of our family culture. So I really didn't get a read on, maybe I'm smelling alcohol, maybe I'm just imagining it, right? And because it was in a nondescript coffee cup or glass, what are you going to say? Things kind of continued to devolve. She started talking crap about some of her friends. She would make inappropriate jokes. There were times when she would disclose things about herself, like her own diagnoses. She told me that she was actually diagnosed with several cluster B disorders, including borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, which is kind of terrifying, attention deficit disorder. She went through all of these things. She was talking about how her father wasn't really her father and it was some other man, and she had a different father from her siblings, just all these things that were way, way out of scope, right? She shared a lot of personal information about her stepdaughter. And so I was trying to figure out how to extricate myself, because at that point I was, how do I get out of here? What if she puts me on blast if I leave? So I have to be on the best behavior because we live in the same city. I'm going to be practicing in this city. So I'm just sitting there kind of yielding in this weird fawn response of, okay, Valerie, wow, that must have been so hard for you. Or wow, like that was so brave of you. And it turned out to be almost like her therapy sessions, until one day the weird behavior had finally kind of hit this peak. And she walked in, she was 10 minutes late, and she comes in with a can of generic White Claw. And she sets the can down, and I'm looking at the can. Does that say hard seltzer on it? Oh my gosh, it does. It was almost completely empty because of the angle at which she was drinking from it. I could tell. And I was, hey, is alcohol? And she got really mad at me and she blew up. It's just like seltzer. It's just like water. It's no big deal. You know how I hate plain water. And she started freaking out about it. I was like, don't worry. It's okay. It's fine. We're at your house. No worries. And then the rest of the session, I kind of just got out of there as peacefully as I could. But this is my last session. I'm not coming back.
Halina knew things needed to end, but a few days after that session, she also started to realize that she needed proper closure. Despite how things were falling apart, she had done some good work in therapy. And part of her felt like she needed to honor that with a real termination session. So nervously, she decided to reach back out to Valerie.
And so I texted her, and this was, I think, on a Tuesday. I texted her and I said, can we talk? The alcohol in session really bothered me, or something like that. And she wrote back, she flipped out at me. It was just like water. I barely even had a sip, going off at me. And she was like, if you really need to talk about it, we can talk about it on Tuesday if you want to come to group. Okay, I guess we'll do that then. Meanwhile, I was so uncomfortable and I was like, I don't know whether I should go or not. Like, she's already blown up at me. Clearly, This woman cannot take one iota of accountability or pushback at all because she's flipping out. So I took a screenshot of her texts to me defending her alcohol in session. And this is the other thing that she said. You always react to things. You always latch on to things and call people out and make a problem when you think that someone's at fault for something and you latch on to it. That's not how I am. That's how you described your mother, Valerie. That's how you described your old boss, Valerie, but that's not me. So I was like, wow, I can't keep this to myself. So I take a screenshot. I send it to my friend Sonia. So this is my therapist. What do I do with this? And of course, my friend Sonia was an associate therapist at the time, which means you're under supervision. And she shared the text with her boss, who was a fully licensed therapist. And her boss said, we need to talk to her because she has to report this, right? And I was still trying to get my bearings because I felt like I just stepped out of a paint shaker with this woman. But I get a call from Sonia's boss. Her name's Terry. And Terry says to me, you need to report this because if she's drinking with clients, that's dangerous and you could lose your license if you don't report her. And now that Sonia told me about it, if you don't report this, I have to, and it'll look a lot better coming from you. And sidebar, I now know that if it were a client telling me that this happened, yes, I'd probably have to report it. But as the client myself, I wasn't under an obligation for that. And I also shouldn't have been pressured to do it so quickly because, like many of your other guests and some other conversations we've had, I was in a weird push-pull because I felt a loyalty to Valerie. I felt a disgust toward her and I was terrified of her all at the same time. There was a part of me that still wanted sort of the sunshine and daisies piece of the relationship to have been real, which was that she took me under her wing because she thought I was special and she thought I was going to be this great clinician and she was trusting me with all her personal stuff. And as inappropriate as all of that was, it felt good. So part of me was still attached to that. I didn't want to betray her. I didn't want to be up in front of one of the mental health boards in the state as a client because that's embarrassing. But I took what Terry said seriously and I was, okay, I guess I have to write a complaint. And I wrote the meekest, most nuanced complaint about Valerie does these things well, but these are sort of concerning. And here are the screenshots. And I tried to be as balanced as possible with it. And I sent it in.
Anybody who's ever submitted an ethics complaint knows it can be a really scary process. It's fraught with a lot of conflicting emotions. Wanting to protect your therapist, wanting justice, wanting an apology, also wanting someone to acknowledge what had happened to you. And really, there's no telling how it will go. This was all new to Halina, and she had no idea what would happen next. Too often, the process is veiled in secrecy and unspoken rules. And that's why it's important to talk about it. And it's part of why I'm so grateful to Halina for sharing her story with us, which will continue in the next episode. Thank you to my guest today, therapist and therapy harm survivor, Halina. Thank you to my brother-in-law and friend, Bo Denton, who is the writer for this show. Your skill and insight as a former therapist are invaluable. Thank you also to the audio engineers of this show, Peachtree Sound. Your attention to detail and skill are greatly appreciated.